shocking lies about sourcing, misleading labels, and officials hoarding rare bottles. The bourbon industry may seem quiet and uncontroversial, but it's also been rocked by a number of scandals.
When I drink bourbon, I get weirdly good at beatboxing.
The enforcement of tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China at the start of the second Trump administration threatened to have a major effect on the bourbon industry.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
Experts on both sides of the US-Canadian border and all sides of the political spectrum have been raising the alarm about steep price increases and political boycotts affecting distilleries, bars, farmers, and many other American jobs related to bourbon production. As of March 2025, no one knows where this scandal's going, but it could change the face of the bourbon industry for years to come. Perhaps the most notorious scandal to ever hit the modern bourbon industry was the great Pappy Van Winkle heist. The story was so juicy and enticing that Netflix covered it in its docuseries, Heist.
A local sheriff says he will leave no stone unturned in finding the culprit for the heist. Bourbon heist!
In 2013, it was discovered that 65 cases of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, among the most expensive bourbons available, were gone without a trace. To make matters more intriguing, Buffalo Trace, the company that distributes Pappy Van Winkle, has specific rules for some of its products. Customers are limited to just one bottle of certain brands from the distillery, and distributors only receive a limited supply. These are known as allocated bottles. This further ups the value of black market Buffalo Trace-produced products. It was discovered that a ring of people, including longtime Buffalo Trace employee Gilbert "Toby" Kurtzinger, were stealing bourbon in quantities totaling over $100,000 from the company.
I mean, that's just the way it is.
Interestingly, while Kurtzinger admits to stealing bourbon, he denies being behind the missing Pappy Van Winkle cases. Kurtzinger was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though he served just 30 days, for his involvement in what is now known as Pappygate. Pappy Van Winkle just cannot catch a break, it seems. In February of 2023, it came to light that high-ranking officials in the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, or OLCC, had used their power to hoard coveted bottles of Pappy Van Winkle. Since Pappy Van Winkle is both expensive and hard to find, just 84,000 bottles of the bourbon hit the market each year. However, the officials rigged the system, sending the state's Pappy Van Winkle supply to one state store near their office. The bottles were held in storage until they got there, where the officials would buy them at face value. Of the 999 bottles received by the state of Oregon in 2022, just 150 made it to the public. OLCC employees scooped up the rest. As a result, the Oregon Department of Justice opened an investigation into the scandal. In March of 2024, however, the Oregon DOJ closed the investigation. No criminal charges were ever filed. Virginia also had a bourbon scandal, and once again, a popular but elusive bourbon was at the heart of this story. When allocated products such as Buffalo Trace come into stock, places such as Virginia have to find a way to distribute the limited supply equitably. To do this, Virginia sent bottles to seemingly randomized locations. In 2022, Edgar Smith Garcia, a lead sales associate for the Virginia ABC stores, used his access to state computers to find out where bottles would be sold. He then gave this information to Robert William Adams, who sold the information to bourbon lovers for $300. The scheme didn't last long. Pretty soon, complaints of people selling the information started popping up on ABC's Facebook page. What was first thought to be a conspiracy theory turned out to be true. That got both men responsible arrested for their actions. When it comes to getting your hands on allocated bottles, companies are just as anxious to get their hands on them as individuals. This thirst for allocated bottles shook the bourbon world when Justin's House of Bourbon was accused of illegal actions, including unlawful alcohol transport and selling counterfeit bottles. Justin's House of Bourbon was originally a Kentucky-based company, but expanded to locations outside the area, including one in Washington, D.C. This is where the trouble began. The D.C. Alcoholic Beverage Regulations Administration brought 11 total violation allegations against Justin's House of Bourbon. Justin Sloan, co-owner of the business, told Whiskey Advocate that the reports were made because they seemingly had too many bottles of allocated alcohol. In the initial investigation, it was found that Justin's was importing bottles of Blanton's bourbon from the Netherlands. The report alleged that the imports were done incorrectly, and that the supplier for another bourbon, Weller, didn't seem to have a license. Another report claimed that the Blanton's bottles were counterfeit. The case has since been resolved, and Justin's was cleared of many important allegations, such as counterfeiting. Justin's was hit with some minor fines for things such as bookkeeping issues, but that's about it. One of the most shocking scandals to rock the bourbon industry occurred when Wilderness Trail Distillery failed to deliver whiskey barrels to Washtaki Holding, leading to a lawsuit. Here's what happened and why it caused so much drama. The Campari Group bought a controlling share of Wilderness Trail Distillery. Campari wanted to use the company's bourbon to expand its own bourbon output. The problem was that 12,500 barrels of Wilderness Trail Distillery 10-year-old bourbon had already been promised to Washtaki Holdings. And you can't exactly just make another few barrels of a product that's been aging for 10 years. Washtaki initially made a deal with Wilderness Trail in 2020, in which it agreed to pay a specific price per barrel for up to 40,000 barrels. The first portion of the deal went off without a hitch. But when Campari took control of Wilderness Trail, the distillery stopped fulfilling the demand. Washtaki looked at the barrels as an investment and claimed it lost out on money due to the lack of whiskey. The company expected to triple its money on each barrel of bourbon, but clearly that never happened.
Denied.
When you buy a bottle of bourbon, it creates an image in your mind of a picturesque distillery crafting its alcohol and aging with care. The truth, though, will shock you. Many companies, including recognizable brands, use sourced whiskey. This means buying barrels from producers and bottling them as its own. This is not a new technique and has been used in other whiskey-making endeavors, such as blended scotch. When it comes to bourbon, however, you may not be getting whiskey from the distillery you expect. Instead, it may be coming from barrels produced by other companies like MGP. MGP has distilleries worldwide and produces an immense amount of bourbon. MGP also only sells to companies, not to individuals. One such company that uses sourced barrels is Widow Jane. This is particularly eye-opening as part of Widow Jane's allure is the use of water from the Widow Jane mine. While Widow Jane does distill some products, the company has also reportedly used bourbon from a Kentucky distillery. Your bottle could be lying to you. With all the regulations around what legally does and does not constitute bourbon, you may be surprised that some of the language on bottles is misleading, if not bald-faced lies.
So before you lie about lying.
So-called small batch bourbon has become increasingly popular, yet it means absolutely nothing legally. The same thing goes for handcrafted and the derivative craft. What is even more surprising is that brands can label a bottle as made by anyone. This is how you get companies that use sourced whiskey and pass it off as made by the company. Sometimes, of course, this kind of marketing does come to bite a company in the behind. In 2014, the bourbon company Maker's Mark was sued over the use of handmade when there are, in fact, machines that do things such as grinding the grain.
Don't you mean, Jack Daniels?
He may be Jack to you, son, but when you've known him as long as I have.
His name is on every bottle and it has become synonymous with whiskey. But the public was shocked to find out that Jack Daniel, the man behind one of the most iconic American whiskeys, was not its actual creator. In reality, an enslaved man named Nathan Nearest Green taught Jasper Jack Daniel how to make whiskey. Daniel and Green first met in the mid-1800s when Daniel was just 7 years old. Green was an exceptional distiller and taught Daniel a charcoal filtration method that is thought to have been inspired by a similar West African water filtration technique. It was this technique that helped Daniel market his smooth whiskey and build his empire. After the Civil War, Green and Daniel stayed together, this time in a partnership where Green was recognized as the master distiller. Today, he is still considered the first African-American master distiller in the United States. But for most of Jack Daniel's history, Green was ignored. That is, until Fawn Weaver uncovered the truth and made it her mission to bring Green's legacy the respect it deserves. Her book about Green, Love and Whiskey, the remarkable true story of Jack Daniel, his master distiller Nearest Green, and the improbable rise of Uncle Nearest, received critical acclaim when it was published in 2024. By Jack Daniel's own admission, it meets every single qualification to be considered a bourbon. Jack is made of a corn mash in America, in new charred oak barrels, and with the necessary alcohol by volume. For all intents and purposes, Jack Daniel's is a bourbon. So why is it labeled Tennessee whiskey? It all began back with the repeal of prohibition laws. With that repeal came the implementation of newly defined categories of liquor. Let's remember that Tennessee whiskey, unlike bourbon, is not a federally designated product. In fact, it did not become a state-defined product until 2013. The government initially told Jack Daniel's that it had to use the bourbon label, as it met all the necessary requirements. However, the company was unhappy about this. So they sent bottles of their whiskey to key bureaucrats, hoping they could persuade the government to change the rules and not force Jack Daniel's to classify itself as a bourbon. And in 1941, it worked. It is impressive that Jack Daniel's can change the definition of bourbon while claiming that they make something else.
Hair of the dog that bit me. Bourbon on the rocks. That'll do her.
The first bourbon scandal revolved around its origins, namely, just who exactly created bourbon. When we look back on bourbon, we cannot pinpoint its exact creator, but there are certain groups who try to claim it as their own. There is documented evidence that a man named Evan Williams opened America's first commercial whiskey distillery in 1783 in Louisville, Kentucky. However, that was just whiskey, not specifically bourbon. From here, things get incredibly murky. The Samuels family often gets credited for the introduction of a secret whiskey recipe in 1783. The family, who were also farmers, made corn-based whiskey. They would go on to found Maker's Mark, though with a different recipe than the original. Just a few years later, Elijah Craig would take credit for introducing the charred oak barrel portion of bourbon into the mix. And in 1795, Jacob Beam released the first barrel of what would later become Jim Beam. The problem with all of these is that while individual contributions and evolutions were made to whiskey during this time, not one of them created the modern-day whiskey and called it bourbon. The first ad for bourbon didn't even show up until 1821, at which point many now classic bourbon distillers had been established. As far as we can tell, no one gets to claim the full creation of bourbon.